According to my clock, it is time to get going. We want to thank you so much for joining us for this discussion today. According to our statistics, we've got folks who signed up to be a part of this event from 28 different states across this country of ours, 90 different organizations, over 100 different job titles and descriptions. We've got everyone from entry-level positions and new to the workforce, as well as folks who have experienced professionals in key positions of leadership, wherever you find yourself on this planet Earth, whatever position you hold and responsibilities that you carry, we welcome you. We are so glad that you are here. My name is Phil Gwolke. I serve as the managing director here at BridgeWorks, and I just want to start off by reminding you that BridgeWorks exists to power potential by cultivating meaningful human connections. Our focus is helping organizations recruit and retain top talent. And with all the changes and challenges that we have endured in society since 2020, it is essential that organizations discover new ways to partner with and support their workforce. Our team is monitoring the chatter across social media feeds, specifically LinkedIn, and all the responses to the events of even just this weekend and the emotions that are driven in this important topic of our day and age. And it just reminds us how critical it is that we come together in a spirit of humility, openness, and have the ability to just understand, listen, and learn from one another. Starting in the fall of 2020, moving forward to the summer of 2021, we at BridgeWorks hosted a series of these community conversations. Some of you were joined us for those. The focus was on issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We featured experts from the business sector, the education career field, those who work focused on human resources, and we invited representation from across section of lenses of diversity to help us answer some of the most complex questions in our societies. We're still wrestling with very complex questions. We took all that information, all those conversations as a team, and we've synthesized the insights that we gained from those discussions to help us develop applicable solutions that we've packaged into what we call our Inclusive Leadership Immersion program. Now, I'm just going to share with you here just a snapshot of what we've made available. In the coming months, we'll be unveiling a suite of tools, starting with online coursework to help your organizations embed inclusive leadership into your culture as more than just a theory that people talk about, but real interpersonal skill sets that can be put into daily practice. Again, the idea of informing or information is taking concepts and changing us from the inside out. So it's not just something that we hold up into our head, but we're able to put into practice on a daily basis with the people around us to make a real difference. In keeping with that tradition, today we are excited to start a new series of community conversations focused on addressing the latest challenges that affect recruitment and retention in the modern workforce. On January 18th of this year, LinkedIn released its Global Talent Trends Report. And the title of this year's report was The Reinvention of Company Culture. Every organization that we are serving right now is wrestling with questions coming out of the pandemic. What's the best way to approach work? How do you create a remote work setting? Do we bring people back to the office? Do we create some type of a hybrid setting? And so again, we're constantly engaging in conversation to try to figure out how we can best serve you to figure out a way to recruit and retain top talent. One of the things that came out in this report we find very important, and it sets us up for today's conversation. In the report, it pointed out that 66% of Gen Z employees want a culture that's built around mental health and wellness. Now, In full disclosure, I am not a licensed therapist. That is not my particular area of expertise. But over the course of BridgeWorks history, our focus is serving as a generational consulting firm. We want to understand what is shaping each generation and help you as leaders and organizations provide the type of environment that's going to keep the next generation of talent operating at peak performance. Research like this informs us that attracting and retaining young talent will require that we learn a little bit more about this very important topic. So today, we are honored to be joined by our guest, Dr. Julie Lee, to help us wrestle with the all too important question of how to responsibly integrate mental health into the modern workforce. Now, we first discovered Dr. Lee through this article that was published by Fast Company. She was written by Dr. Lee, and the title of the article was 4 Ways to Foster a Workplace Culture That Champions Mental Health. And we knew that this was someone that we wanted to connect with. Dr. Lee is a clinical psychologist, a behavioral health strategist, and educator who helps organizations create an engaging workplaces through mental health inclusivity. Again, our focus at BridgeWorks is how engaging, recruiting, retaining the workforce. Our learnings from last year all focus around inclusive leadership. And when we saw these elements of her area of expertise, we knew this was someone that could help us advance the conversation into today's most pressing issues. She's held a supervisor and instructional roles at Harvard University, Brown University, and Wellesley College. So with no further delay, it is my honor to welcome Dr. Lee to this conversation. And we're so glad that you're here. Thank you for being here. How are you doing, Dr. Lee?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much, Phil, for that warm and kind introduction. It's my honor and privilege to join you for this important conversation. And I also want to thank all the audience who have taken time from their busy schedule to join this conversation. I like to, before we get started, I'd like to add that in addition to being a clinical psychologist and consultant, the reason why the mental health issue is so close to my heart is because I have had both personal and professional experience with mental health concerns for myself as well as those that I care about. So I am very, very mindful of the fact that no one is immune from experiencing the challenges that impact our mental health during the course of our life experience and work experience. As we begin our conversation, I also want to acknowledge just how challenging the last over 2 years have been. And it has been, the mental health concern is not a personal struggle. It is really a collective experience. And I think it's so important for all of us to approach this conversation and this topic with compassion for ourselves, as well as compassion for those with whom we work.
Yeah, that is so true. And thank you for framing it in such a way as to say, hey, this is something that touches us all at some level or another, personally, professionally, our families, and it is something that I like that idea that as communities, we have to address it. So here we are in this community conversation. I just want to remind our attendees kind of the format of how we approach this. If you've been to these sessions before, you're familiar. The entry fee is a question. We just wanted to know what's top of mind to you. And we've compiled the questions that you have submitted, kind of organized them by categories. And throughout the session today, I'm going to ask the questions that both you submitted, as well as a handful of questions that I am hearing from the marketplace as our team is out in the field helping organizations recruit and retain talent. And we hear questions around this topic. I've infused some of my questions as well that we've come from those discussions. And throughout the session, we encourage you. I've got the chat feature open. I'm going to be monitoring that. So if there's certain moments that you maybe want a little clarification around, we'll keep an eye on the chat feature. Also, there is the question and answer function that is available on Zoom. So at the Dr. Lee and I are going to move through your questions for the first, next 35 or so minutes. And then the final 15 minutes is an open forum. We just want you to submit your questions to us, and we'll do our best to answer them as it relates to workforce challenges. So hopefully that tees us up nicely, and I'm going to get us going here with our first question for Dr. Lee. Why, in your opinion, do you believe it's so important for organizations to address mental health? And I'm also curious, what impact do you think the pandemic may have had on the well-being of today's workforce, maybe especially for Gen Z who are starting out in this very tumultuous environment?
Right. Thank you for starting us off and this conversation with that important question, Phil. I think all of us, if we were to step back and sit back for a minute or two, could probably all reflect upon ways in which the pandemic has impacted us individually, as a family, as a community, and as a workplace. No one has been untouched by pandemic. The statistics has revealed that mental health concern in the US was already becoming worrisome and was trending in the direction of people experiencing greater challenges even before pandemic. But of course, since the pandemic, we have experienced a multitude of stressors that have touched many of us. Many of us have struggled with our own health. If we contracted COVID, many of us have had loved ones who were infected by COVID, or even lost our loved ones to COVID. When we think about a number of deaths that we have had, and really the loss that we have to contend with in this country, it's not surprising that we're holding a lot of grief and loss. In addition, many of us may be caretakers, whether as a parent or a caretaker for our loved ones or even friends. That responsibility has also been significant. I have been talking with and hearing from people who said, I've just this weekend, I was talking with someone who said, I feel like someone who said that he has been a sole caretaker for his elderly parent. And he felt he has carried the responsibility of making sure that parent stays healthy and well for the last 2.5 years. That's an enormous responsibility. Of course, not to mention that all of us experienced a transition to remote work, which brought a lot of disruptions and transitions that we could not have really predicted before pandemic. With all those factors in mind, I think there are a number of, I could think of 3 reasons why it is so important for us to really put mental health and wellness at workplace at the center of our how we think about and how we approach our work life. I think the first statistic is something that you've already touched upon, and that is close to 80% of the people when asked express experiencing an elevated level of distress or mental health concern. That means if you're working in a team of 10 members, all but 2 are struggling. I think what that means to me is if I look around and look at my colleague, the chances are they're more likely to be experiencing some form of challenge in their mental health and wellness than not. So that's a staggering reality. Yes. So when we think about that and bring that into our conversation, I think the question is no longer, should we do something about mental health in our workplace? I think it really becomes, what can we do and what should we do in recognition of the reality? I think the second reason that you pointed out already, Phil, is the expectation that I think all of us, and especially the Gen Z, are bringing to workplace. The Gen Z, in by virtue of currently being in the age of 10 to 26, they're the generation that have, in some ways, have been most impacted by pandemic. Their educational experience have been disrupted. Their entry to workplace have been interrupted. Certainly, their personal and social trajectory had been disrupted by pandemic. I think in many ways, I think they are going to be leading us in elevating the importance of mental health. And I think the statistic that you just referenced, over 60% of Gen Z saying the mental health is an important consideration when they select or stay in workplace, I think really gives us a clear indication why this needs to be important factor. And lastly, I would also say that we are, as a society, is going through a systemic shift and change in how we think about what it means to live a life well lived, and also what role does our workplace play in our life. Many of us have shifted to remote work or hybrid work. I think many organizations are grappling with how they're going to engage and continue to build their workforce that has a sense of community and productive. So I think this is a unique time for all organizations, as you said, to really think about how do we really think about the future of work? And I think mental health and wellness will have to be a part of it.
Well, thank you. Such a complete answer. And I'm just intrigued when you mentioned we were trending in this direction pre-pandemic, right? And so everything was just been exacerbated since then. So all three of those reasons that you mentioned only became more intense as history was unfolding versus, okay, we've got that under control. I'm curious, in your article that you wrote that we referenced earlier, you talk about, the 4 C's of mental health. It's fabulous. And you also mentioned the return on investment of addressing mental health in the workplace. Here's a question that someone asked, which I'd love for you just to give us your brief understanding of how to approach this. The question was, how do I talk to old school people, in quotes, who refer to those mental health issues as just being crazy, right? What advice can you offer to begin to have a conversation, responsible conversations about this topic with people who are just struggle to even, they don't come from an era that openly discussed matters like this, especially in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question, because I think it's an important one. And as you just said, Phil, I think it's so important for us to collectively acknowledge that this is a new era for all of us, no matter where we fall in that generation spectrum. There is a generational difference, I think, because we've been socialized differently in terms of how comfortable we are, or even how much knowledge we have about mental health concerns. I'm really encouraged at times to see that mental health language and literacy is now being introduced in K-12. And that's, I think, is a very important progress. Yet that was not the experience of those of us who have been out of school for quite some time. Right. So I would say the important approach is humility and openness. And to really acknowledge that it is not because someone may not care or don't want to really learn, but we're really coming to this conversation about mental health from a different vantage point. Yeah. So I would say the two elements that I think about is really curiosity and compassion. And I think it's important for all of us to bring curiosity to conversation about mental health and say, what might someone in my workplace maybe find it difficult to talk about mental health, and maybe even ask that question openly, right, and with curiosity. And if you have a colleague who shares their own experience with mental health concerns, to really do the best we can to bring compassion and to acknowledge that taking such a step takes courage and that person is becoming vulnerable. that kind of trust is sacred and is to be honored.
Oh, I love that answer. Our whole work in inclusive leadership is built on this premise that when we engage people in the conversation, that they are not the problem, that they are the solution. I think when we encounter someone who, like you said, might be uncomfortable for whatever reason, we tend to point the finger of blame and so forth. But your answer to approach them and say, hey, might not be that they don't care, they just haven't embraced or engaged in these discussions before. Our whole definition of diversity is simply a unique set of experiences that foster a new perspective. That person had different experiences than, say, young people are today, and young people entering the workforce are certainly having different experiences than I may have when I entered. And so taking all these things into consideration is what creates that open dialogue, if what I'm hearing you is correct. But to the point of dialogue, Dr. Lee, I got to ask you a tricky question. We in the highly sensitive environment that we're in, there's certain words that can spark reaction, and not everyone is privileged to know what are the right words, what are the wrong words. And so I'm just curious, give us just a quick vocabulary guide, if you will. What are the do's and don'ts if I am going to begin to approach this conversation in the workplace? You mentioned that it's in K through 12 education is starting to elevate the mindset now, but I didn't have that class when I was growing up. So what are the words that I should and shouldn't be using to be responsible today?
It's such a wonderful and practical and important question. I'll start my response by saying, I think we're all developing a new language. And really new vocabulary to talk about mental health issues in workplace, probably for the first time in our collective experience. Even though it's hard to be definitive about do's and don'ts, I think there are some phrases and expressions that I heard from others in the workplace that is really troublesome and concerning, and often tend to leave the colleagues feeling misunderstood or judged. Mm-hmm. So some of the phrases that I've heard that I would really caution all of us from using include, do you mean that when someone discloses that they have a mental health issue, to say, do you mean that you are crazy and you have problems? That is a very, very invalidating and painful for someone who is struggling with a mental health issue. I think also a phrase like, I had no idea that you would be someone who would have a mental health concern. Sometimes people could use such a phrase to express surprise, or to express that they was not previously aware of a colleague's struggle, but yet statement like that could further stigmatize and make it difficult for that person to engage meaningfully with their mental health concern with their colleague or their supervisors. So I think it's really important for us to be mindful of what impact the words and the phrases that we choose to use with our colleague will have in their experience as a colleague in our workplace. In terms of what we can do and should aspire to do, is to really bring, again, I go back to both curiosity and compassion. I think it's really important for us to show and display humility, and to say, this is not something that I know much about. Could you help me to understand? That's very, very different than saying, I don't care to know. Sometimes it's difficult to be open and vulnerable, but yet if we were to say, I would like to know because I care about you and you are an important colleague of mine, but I don't really have a base of knowledge to have this conversation, I think it could actually open a dialogue that can be productive and supportive. So those are a few things that come to my mind.
That's great. That's a great pro tip. I imagine glad to hear that, let's be clear, crazy is a no-no. We're not going to use that word to engage in this conversation. But, words all carry weight and different amounts of meaning to different people, but your advice around being mindful of the impact. And it's really, I hadn't considered the idea that, saying, oh, I had no idea you were wrestling with that, might come across as somewhat invalidating or take away what this person was transparent enough to discuss. So that's a great insight to be aware of what that outcome might be. I think, again, our framework, our focus is helping leaders, organizations responsibly engage with something that they didn't see coming necessarily. And so as we talk about inclusion, we help people understand, hey, there's real value in a unique experience. So this isn't a problem, but there's an opportunity here to learn and to grow. And that curiosity that you talk about is right in line with the tools that we try to equip people with to manage those different expectations and experiences that they encounter. And I'll be honest, people are asking for tools. I'm watching the chat here. I'm looking at the Q&A, and we want to dive into what are some of those best practices that organizations can begin to put into place. And I just, this is a big one. I was a part of a session just a week ago, a little over a week ago, and I had a chance to hear another presenter talk. She wrote a book talking about destigmatizing mental health in the workplace. And I know you have some insight around that. So what are some ways that we can take the mystery and the stigma out about this conversation and begin to address it in a way that maintains the value of everyone on that spectrum of experiences that are so important for us to embrace?
Another great question for us to really wrestle with. As you referenced, I'd like to actually bring a few points that I had included in that article in Fast Company. A couple of points that I mentioned in terms of how organization could destigmatize mental health and discussion of mental health include commitment and culture. To unpack a little bit, by commitment, I referenced the commitment from the senior leaders of the organization. I think it's really important for leaders in each organization to really come to conversation as a team to wrestle with what is their approach to mental health and wellness, and what is their commitment to really supporting their workforce along the line of wellness and mental health. I found it really interesting that when asked in the survey that was released by Deloitte about two weeks ago, when asked about asked the Gen Zs, have you seen a meaningful change in mental health and wellness programs in the workplace in the last year and a half? Many people felt there's been discussion about mental health, but they have not really felt a meaningful change. So to me, that was really telling. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that, tackling an issue and really addressing a stigma that is both internalized and externalized is going to take time. But yet at the same time, I think it really requires a candid conversation and discussion among the leaders to say what it is that we really hope to accomplish. What does it mean for us to really see each member of our organization as a human being, not just someone who is doing a job? So in many ways, it, I think, sort of brings us back to the related concept of culture. Really thinking about mental health not as a benefit, not something that is included when someone joins the firm as a list of benefits only. I want to be clear that I think having a robust a mental health support and resource is very important and is almost expected by Gen Z. and some millennials from their workplace. But yet that's not enough. I think we're talking about going beyond having resources to creating a culture and a climate where we can really bring our full self and our concerns around, about the mental health in a space that feels supportive and inclusive and validating.
Wow, that you you touched on some really important topics in there. The idea that it's not just a benefit, that when you sign on to our organization, we have, mental health is a part of our, medical health benefits, but we are a culture that supports that authenticity and that transparency. One of our attendees asked the question, how do you get people thinking beyond mental health as a weakness? And I think that's such a key question, because as we look at this from a generational standpoint, there's no way, baby boomers, when they started their careers, that these conversations would have been open-ended as it would have been interpreted or seen as a sign of weakness. But it's also interesting that when those same baby boomers entered the workforce, the previous generations looked at them as those long-haired hippie troublemakers, peace-loving, all kinds of things that they were seeing, that how they showed up as their authentic self at the time was seen as being weak or creating problems. And there's actually research that a lot of previous generations quit the workforce because they couldn't handle baby boomers entering, then. And so often we see different as weak. And I think this whole conversation is about learning to understand, and your previous advice about just asking, hey, this is not something I'm really familiar with, but I care enough to learn more about what you're experiencing. There's that alone begins to address how to change that mindset. But I want to come back to something you just said and keep us moving here, because you're on fire and I want to keep this going. You said that leadership, one, needs to have conversation together, and they need to be committed to creating real support. So let's just hypothetically say the leaders call Dr. Lee up and they want to have, they're committed, but their question is, what are the best strategies to support employees with mental health? How would you answer that question? What should they be committed to doing?
I think my first response to such a question would be to say, we really have to get to know who's in your organization. I think it's so important for us to really see people in each organization really as experts and authority in their own experience. I think that's the approach that I bring to work and any group and organization that I support. So my first recommendation is, say, let's engage your workforce and see what they're experiencing. What are their pain points? In what ways are they struggling or experiencing mental health challenges? And what can we do as an organization to provide meaningful support? So I think having a conversation and engagement with the people in each organization is so important. The mental health support is not a one-size-fits-all. Each organization is unique, as you well know, Phil. Industry, organization size, work that they do, demographic of talent in that organization significantly impacts the work experience. So it's so important for us to keep all that in mind and try to really understand who it is that we are trying to support. For instance, according to some survey that has been released in some organizations, the greatest challenge in the last 2 years for some of the employees have been managing parenting responsibilities. And that probably doesn't come as a surprise for those of us who have parenting responsibilities, who had to really balance the work responsibilities with virtually doing a full-time educational support for our children at home. That was an enormous task, enormous challenge for many families. So if your workforce has a lot of working parents or caretakers, that would absolutely be an important area to address. So
Right.
that would be the first approach. The second approach is to really think about creating a culture and creating a really a peer-led opportunities that really elevate the conversation about mental health and wellness, whether that takes the form of a traditional ERGs, employee resource group, or something that is different and more innovative. I think it's important that conversation happen both at the leadership level as well as at the experience level.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really key. And I think when we spoke earlier, you talked about the importance of leadership serving as that model. But leaders can only be in so many places at so many times. So the goal of leadership is to reproduce that themselves and others so that everyone is embodying this type of a support. That's when you get to a place of real cultural shift. I mentioned earlier at the top of the hour, kind of these e-learning series that we've developed all around inclusive leadership. And the goal, many of the modules or the elements discuss things like tactical empathy. How can I embrace, have conversations in a way that truly foster belonging and value in my colleagues? And these are skills that, not everyone just automatically has. These are things that need to be learned. And it sounds like from what we discussed that leadership needs to learn that, and then they need to pass it on to others. And I like what you said earlier, there's a real opportunity here where our incoming new workforce could be some of the best teachers, educators in this, because this is an environment, they grew up hearing more of that message. Not all, but many, some who've had the privilege of having that in their education system, or just the setting that they grew up in, the environment that shaped them. So I think there's a lot that we can begin to learn from each other here in this space. One of the other things I think is interesting when you were describing just what it means to be a parent and how that fostered the need for maybe a little bit more support in this environment where you're both a parent, a professional, and a part-time educator, through the pandemic. And my mom was a single mom, but I grew up in a time when there was a lot more free-range children, and society was okay with that. She worked her 60 hours a week and just trusted I'd be okay. Today, parents feel way more pressure to be far more involved than my mom would have felt at that time. And so again, all things that we have to recognize things have changed, therefore we need to change. I think that's what this really boils down to. In your article, you mentioned, I think, what you call employee assistance programs. We had a question: what are the key components of an effective employee resource program? How do you get, and then with that, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how do organizations go about putting these things in place. But then, and here's another key question, and I see this all the time, that this was the topic of Dr. Tanya Glenn's presentation when I saw her present, is a lot of times organizations provide these resources, but then people don't take advantage of them because of maybe the stigma, or they're too busy, or so forth. So one, what does a good program look like? Two, how do you get people to utilize them?
Again, those are great questions for all of us to be engaging. And I think it's important for us to say, I think we're all learning collectively. I have some thoughts and suggestions and recommendations that I bring to organization that I work with, but I always go in with the approach of learning from people who's in it. So I think the first approach that I would emphasize is let's go to the source. Let's ask people in the organization, what kind of support would they like, and in what ways would what type of support would feel safe and acceptable and comfortable for them. So I think when we talk about the mental health issues, I think it's important to acknowledge there's an understandable concern on part of the employees about how would disclosing their mental health concern might impact the perception of their performance.
Right.
I mean, this is I think it's so important for us to acknowledge that is the reality that many people contend with. In fact, in the Deloitte survey that I referenced a few minutes ago, actually mentioned that almost half of employees who ended up taking a medical leave for a mental health reason did not feel comfortable disclosing that they were in fact struggling with a mental health issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that is the reality. So how do we start to create space and opportunity where we could really bring our honest and full experience to conversation without being concerned about the repercussions? So I think there's many different approaches. We're thinking about the privacy and the trust. I think one of the things that I tend to bring to the conversation in talking about whether it's a peer support group or formal employee resource group is it's important that people feel that they're not going to be quote unquote noticed, that participation is voluntary, but also the privacy, if they chose, is respected. I think, I think there's another benefit to having a peer support model in workplace around mental health issues for that reason. I think many people express that it's uncomfortable sometimes to have a very detailed conversation or open conversation about mental health issues with someone in authority. So I think that brings another layer of consideration. And the last piece I will bring into conversation is something that I actually came across in preparation for this meeting, that in the past, sometimes the employee resource group was labeled as a wellness group or even disability group. And I think a lot of people are saying those two traditional labels do not really speak to the real concern about mental health. The wellness is an important topic, but wellness tend to refer to addressing holistic sense of wellness, preventing burnout, managing stresses, really, really important topics that should be part of our discussion. Yet it doesn't completely overlap in addressing concerns or experience of those who actually have mental health concerns. So I think some of the responders to the survey mentioned that it's really important to make sure that if there is such a support group, that it is very clear that it is for people who really want to speak very directly and explicitly about mental health concerns.
Wow, you've raised my consciousness around that, because I would have naturally kind of fused all of that together and not really thought about, identifying the distinctions that can exist. And if I heard you right, it's not that they're exclusive of one another. The wellness and well-being is still important, but for folks that want to address some mental health issues, it's a little bit beyond, there's a specificity to it that needs to be taken into consideration.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you for that. We're quickly approaching our time here that I want to open it up to the audience to submit more questions. I've got a few other questions that are teed up. I think, so if your questions are bubbling, be ready to share them with us if we haven't addressed them so far. But I want to move to a couple of questions that were a little bit more personal and maybe somewhat applicable, actionable, strategic in nature. So I'm in this position where I serve as the managing director of the firm. I also happen to be a part of a firm that we're kind of a family. We try to support and care for one another. And there's this constant tug of war, if you will, between balancing productivity and also being conscious of providing folks the support that they need to maybe wrestle with some challenges that in their life. And so I always want to be mindful of my team's needs, but also responsible to my clients' requests. And what do you advise that people, how do we find that balance to make sure that the work gets done, but the people are get it done in a way that they feel cared for?
I think that's actually really at the core of I think all of our conversation pieces up to this point, Phil. I appreciate the fact that clearly you're someone who cares deeply about people that work with you and for you, and I think that really speaks to your commitment. At the same time, we have responsibilities and jobs for which we are engaged with our work. So I go back to having a culture, building a culture of open communication, where both the managers and supervisors and team members could have an open dialogue about what is the expectation and the work that needs to be done, and whether or not there's some mental health concern that might be impeding with those work at times. I think creating an open conversation, I think is important, because sometimes the employees wait until they get to a point where they're no longer really able to engage with work. There's so concern about how starting a conversation about mental health might be perceived or it be experienced. They actually wait until to a point where they might even have to take a leave. But if there is an opportunity to have an open conversation when they're starting to struggle, there might be a flexibility or some alternative work plan that might make it possible for that person to continue to be engaged in work. That would also give an opportunity for supervisor and teams to have some planning in place. Maybe there's redistribution of the work responsibilities or alternative plans that could be put in place well in advance of getting to a point where the work has to come to a halt.
Yeah, I think that's a great reminder, going back to one of the earlier questions about what is the return on investment in this. And, to quote an old, I think it's a Benjamin Franklin saying, a stitch in time will save nine. So if you're willing to have an ounce of prevention up here on the front end and not let this build to a place where people just have to completely, disconnect altogether because the challenge has gotten so strong. And if you're a responsible organization, you allow that person time to recover. If you're maybe a little insensitive, you might let that person go, and now you have to find a replacement for that person. Either way, you're enduring the cost of downtime. It sounds like with just some responsible front end work here, you can save yourself a lot of potential challenging back end issues. And again, we know that in the environment that we're in, the needs are, it's no one's fault necessarily, but it is our reality that these issues have risen to the surface given where society is right now, the tension, the stress, the pressure. And so it's just an issue that needs to be addressed. I really appreciate that insight, because I think it's key.
If I may, I would just add a quick point.
Yes, please.
Because related to that, Phil, that I think when we experience compassion and care in a genuine way from our colleagues, from our supervisors in workplace, not only does that mean a lot to us and potentially could make a difference in our own mental health experience, I would argue that it is going to actually, in the long run, probably increase that individual's commitment to the organization.
Yes.
I'm not suggesting that the approach should be taken strategically only from that retention point of view, even though that is an important reality. But I do believe that when we actually bring the whole humanity and genuine care for our employees, I think the result will end up being having a supportive workplace where people are more likely to say, this is a place that I want to continue to work in because I feel known and cared for.
Yeah, I think you're so right there. And I appreciate your caution to say, well, people shouldn't do this, leaders shouldn't do this just because it's in their best interest, to engage in it. And yet, when we've approached a lot of this work, our diversity training, our generational training, we make the case, look, it is in your best interest to embrace the fullness of your workforce, to understand them better. And in a lot of our research, when we talk about the case for inclusion, it benefits your as you take people's perspective into consideration, your own mental capacity, your brain activity becomes stronger, more holistic. You think clearer just by wrestling with some of these questions. So it makes you a better leader, makes you a more effective organization. And I think ultimately, like you said, increases the retention because people feel like, okay, I'm cared for here. All right, I think we're getting in a couple of questions here. And we are into that time of the hour here. So if you have some questions, feel free to use the Q&A feature or the chat. I'm going to, it's a rather lengthy question, so I want to make sure I capture all this. I'm wondering how to positively influence culture in a workplace where leadership seems on constantly highlighting the positive and glossing over the negative. So that's really key. This conversation is messy. It means that folks have to stop saying everything's great. And we've got, some challenges that we need to figure out here. So they give the example, let's think about all the silver linings from the pandemic. Yay, but no acknowledgement for the loss, no acknowledgement for, of loved ones, and so forth, the disconnection. So how do you get people to, and I'm probably the poster child for this question because I'm Mr. Positive, and every now and then someone has to grab me by the shoulder and say, Phil, we got to address some issues here. And so how do you get a guy like me to stop pointing out the silver linings and recognize that there's some darkness that we got to go through together?
Right. I appreciate that question. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. I would say, I think it's important for us to have sort of a full conversation, both with the challenges and struggles, as well as opportunity for growth and change. I think that happens from my experience of consulting. I think those conversations are best starting at a team level. So really equipping the managers. And I want to sort of want to acknowledge and really appreciate those of you who are in the audience who have supervisory roles, that you have truly have carried an important responsibility during the past, over 2 years during the pandemic. It's affected all of us, but especially those of us who have had responsibility to really manage a team and support team members. We had to sort of contend with our own personal experience of pandemic with caring for those. So I actually want to say, I think it's so important for organizations to recognize how important the supervisors and managers are and to provide support for them and make sure that they're feeling supported and validated and feeling valued for the work that they do that impacts the individual's team's work. At the same time, really provide training and opportunity for those managers and supervisors to be able to have conversations, both about things that are challenging and difficult, as well as the way in which the teams can move forward.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for that sensitivity. We've got another question here. Just someone really brought it back again. You've got previous generations who look at this conversation in such a way as to think that we're asking them to engage in this conversation, and it means I have to baby my workforce. I hired professionals. I hired workers, not, cases or issues, and so how do you get people to break out of that mindset? And I want to take just a first stab at this, and then Dr. Lee, I'd love to know your thoughts as well. This is one of the conversations that many organizations have wrestled with, just as it relates to diversity. You know, why do we have to do this additional effort to attract a certain population that might be underrepresented? At the end of the day, isn't really about the, you know, the outcome of the product or the work. Why should there be more of this demographic or that? Why do I have to go to all these extra efforts? And in this case, it's all about perception. I believe it's this perception that because someone is open and honest enough to mention that there's something I'm struggling with, that it means that there's a problem here, rather than seeing this is a type of person who is showing up, has the credibility, the confidence to bring their authentic self to the table. Amy Edmondson was a researcher who coined the phrase psychological safety. And she had this belief that if people felt safe, there would be less mistakes done in the workplace. And her initial research proved her wrong, or so she thought. What turned out to look like more mistakes was really people willing to honestly say what's going on in the organizations that she was surveying. And so for those folks who quote view this as babying, really what you are working with are an honest group of people who are willing to talk about real issues. In this society, with everything going on, you know, I don't care what your industry is, if you've hired people who are just trying to look like everything's okay, but not address real issues, your competitors are going to outpace you. Your technology is going to get stale. Your onboarding programs are going to be stuck in the past. You are going to lose your competitive edge, and you are going to lose your workforce because you're not dealing with what's really going on. And you've got a group of people here who are willing to say, hey, this is what's really going on. So why not see that as a benefit versus a problem? So again, a lot of our work is just retuning the thinking of people who experience different as an issue and not see it as an opportunity. And so again, I apologize. I get ranting on my soapboxes, but to me, it's exciting because you know, we've just come through such a transition where everything we thought we knew about how the world should work has changed. And there's a great opportunity here to retool and improve and get ready for the next iteration of society that we're seeing continually, we're continually encountering on a regular basis.
Thank you. I really love your passion and a clear commitment to really see those conversations and transformations happen in workplace. So I really appreciate your insight, Phil, and the work that you and your colleagues do. I think one, and I'll try to do this briefly, one caveat I might add is, if if a leader is struggling to really grapple and embrace an important importance of mental health or diversity, it would be important to actually create a safe opportunity for them to actually sort of explore what it is that is making it difficult for them. Those conversations are probably best to be had in one-on-one with a trusted confidant or a colleague or a coach. But it's really important because when all of us, when we are struggling to change, there's usually a reason. Yeah. And usually the reason has something to do with some kind of fear that is being activated. So I would actually say, bring compassion even into that space, and to really, invite the leader to kind of engage deeply and personally with what it is that bringing up for them that makes it difficult, and see it as a growth opportunity.
Wow, great wisdom there. I appreciate that. Again, coming back to your ability to understand everyone's feelings, or your intent to understand, okay, what is the barrier here, and help that person move through it. Well, we are at the very end of our time here, and I wanted to just share one more thing as we wrap up. Dr. Lee, you have some exciting things on the horizon that we just wanted to let our attendees know about. You've kind of, as your career evolves, you've got some resources available. Anything you want to share about what you've got going on in the future here?
Yes, thank you for that invitation. So I am now engaged full-time as a behavioral health strategist and consultant that help organization to do exactly what we've talked about during this conversation, to really put mental health and employee engagement in front and center. So for those of you who are interested in this topic, who enjoyed this conversation, please feel free to visit my website at julieleephd.com. And there is a form that you could complete if you're interested in staying in touch or reaching out for possible collaboration.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. Your insights have been incredibly valuable. Appreciate it. We're always on a journey of learning, and so the opportunity to partner with experts like you in our effort to advance a world where workforce is excited to be a part of the organizations that they've partnered with. And so your insights today have just given us another layer of thinking to incorporate into that effort. For those of you who have joined us today, again, we appreciate your partnership. Please feel free to reach out to us. We will always be your inclusive leadership partners. We'll always be your generational experts on the ready, as well as just the firm that will help you recruit and retain the best talent out there. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we appreciate you being a part of this event.